Oh, yes. Excellent. It seems that we are having a video. Excellent. Welcome to class. This is a recorded lecture. It should be pretty exciting. So instead of being in class right now, you're at home, which is great. So for today, basically what we're doing is a lecture. And it's going to be great. If you have any questions about the lecture, write them down on the side and then ask me during class or after class or during conference period when you see me next. Okay, so we're doing basically a lecture. The big difference is that it's recorded. That's good for you. If you think I talk too slow, you can play it on double speed. If you think I talk too fast, you've got a couple seconds to pause it in there, which is good for you if you want it. And then the big difference is that if you have questions, you can't ask them right now because it's recorded. I'm not actually here with you. But write your questions down and come ask them in conference after school on Wednesday or bring them to class. Okay? Excellent. So today we're looking at the spread of communism largely after World War II, right? We already looked at communism and the communist revolution in Russia. We are moving to communism in other places and how that develops. Specifically how this plays into the Cold War. That's what Unit 8 is all about. And remember, the Cold War is tensions between communist and capitalist countries. Okay. We've talked a lot about capitalist countries in the past. That's our Western countries, the United States, Britain, France, those are capitalist countries, and our communist countries. We looked at the Soviet Union. That's our first large-scale communist country. In this lecture, we're going to look at other countries that go communist and that start to play a major role. Especially today, we're going to look at China. China becomes the number 2 communist power in the world. We'll also look at a few smaller communist movements. Excellent. If I said some stuff just now about the Cold War and you were like, whoa, I did not learn that yet, it's probably because you're listening to the recorded lecture before we'll meet, and I'll see you probably tomorrow afternoon and we'll go through some more Cold War stuff. If you're watching this video lecture after we've had our first in-person class, then that Cold War stuff makes sense with what we did in class. Okay, so don't panic, you're not behind. We're fine. Excellent. Here's a beautiful slide. Oh, yeah. So we're looking at China, how they go from being a dynasty, right? We've looked at all these Chinese dynasties, the Zheng, Zhou, Qin, Han, Sui, Tang, Song, Yang, Ming, Qing, how they go from being this dynastic state to being a communist state. And this is going to happen in the roughly 40-year period from 1910 to 1950. Excellent. Boy, the typing's on the slide is a little small. That's okay. The Qing dynasty. Last time we looked at them, remember they were losing power. They were behind in industrialization. They had not industrialized, they hadn't westernized, they hadn't modernized, and that was leading to them having some power losses. And a few examples we looked at were the Opium Wars that they fought with Britain and then later with France, where they ended up losing because they were behind in industrialization and they had to sign unequal treaties, right? Because they didn't have as much power, they weren't on equal bargaining space. And then as a result of those unequal treaties, Britain and France, and then later other countries as well, set up spheres of influence in China. And that sphere of influence is where the foreign country has extraterritoriality rights within China. They don't have to follow Chinese laws. We talked about all of these things, the Opium Wars, the spheres of influences, as example of economic imperialism, where the British and the French and other Western powers use their military superiority to undermine that Qing autonomy. So the Qing government is not in charge of everyone who's in China. The Westerners don't follow Qing rules. And in the spheres of influence, the Qing really don't have that autonomy that they would like to have. Excellent. Another example we looked at from 1894 was the Sino-Japanese War. So the Chinese go to war with Japan. Japan's this country over here, right? Japan is a lot smaller than China, and yet in the Sino-Japanese War, China gets defeated by Japan. Why? Because Japan, during the Meiji Restoration, had committed to industrialization, and because of their advanced militarization and industrialization, they were militarily superior to China, and therefore they beat them. That's embarrassing for China. They've known Japan for thousands of years. They know that they're way bigger than Japan, and yet they're defeated by them. Another example we looked at of weakening Qing dynasty was the Boxer Rebellion in 1898. The Boxers are a Chinese group that are anti-foreigner. They don't like the spheres of influence. They want to kick foreigners out. They're supported by the Empress Cixi. They rebel against foreigners. They try and keep them out. And then just like in the Opium Wars, the foreigners have better military power and they win and put down that Boxer rebellion. The Boxers are not successful. It's significant. The Boxer rebellion is significant because it shows that a lot of Chinese people were not happy with how things were going. It's also significant. Cixi represents for us an element of division in the government, where Cixi supports the Boxer Rebellion. She's anti-foreigner, and she's anti-modernization as well. Remember, in the 100 Days Reform, China had tried to industrialize and modernize, and Cixi sabotaged that movement. So we have both people in China who are unhappy with how things are going, and we have division in the government, where some government members like Cixi are anti-foreign and anti-modernization, and other government members are trying to progress and trying to regain stance on the international playing court. Overall, the Qing government in this especially in the last 10 years as we move into the 1900s, is not an example of effective governance. They're not holding and maintaining power well. They're not administering the government well. In 1911, during popular unrest, the last emperor abdicated and says, I'm done being the emperor and someone else can be in charge of China now. That popular unrest that led to the emperor resigning or abdicating the throne was the 1911 revolution. And this is where we get to the second point on our slide right here. So the 1911 revolution, the goal of that revolution was to overthrow the dynasty, to say the Qing dynasty is no longer functioning well, we need a new form of government. The thing that makes this 1911 revolution different than any other Chinese revolution is their goal. It's not just to overthrow the emperor, but it's to create some new sort of government. Previous Chinese revolutions had the goal of overthrowing the empire and then creating a new dynasty, right? So the Ming were overthrown and replaced by the Qing. Before that, the Yao were overthrown and replaced by the Ming. This is different. The revolutionaries in 1911 went to create a new type of government. The main leader of this revolution was Sun Yat-sen. This is him over here. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is a man. He's educated in the West, so outside of China, in Europe, and based on that, he wanted Western-style rights. So some things he wanted national self-determination. That means a country gets to decide their own political autonomy. They're not imperialized by others. He wanted to get rid of Western imperialism. That word national self-determination is one that's echoed frequently and meaningfully in Wilson's 14 points, this idea that countries should be able to be in charge of themselves and not be colonized by other people. So he wants national self-determination. Sun Yat-sen also wants popular sovereignty. He wants people to be able to vote for who's in government, to have a say in what laws are made. Sun Yat-sen also wants an equal distribution of property. It sounds a little bit communist, right? Like everyone gets an equal amount. And it is a little bit. It also has a big perspective in Chinese history, where at this point in Chinese history, only a few aristocrats owned big portions of land, and a lot of people were landless peasants. And Sun Yat-sen said, if we're going to modernize, we need people to own property and have property rights, and the way to get there first is to redistribute property so people are starting off in a good place. That's Sun Yat-sen. He's the leader of the 1911 revolution, and he is really this playing force in wanting to bring Western-style rights and government to China. In 1912, this movement that Sun Yat-sen leads becomes known as the Kuomintang. Kuomintang. So the Kuomintang, sometimes you'll see it spelled with a G. Kuomintang, Kuomintang, those two are the same word. It is a large political party / government that becomes in charge of China, right? 1911, the emperor abdicates. Sun Yat-sen is in charge, and he names this party that he's in charge of the Kuomintang. If we translate that into English, it translates roughly to Chinese Nationalist Party. So sometimes you'll see Kuomintang with a K, Kuomintang with a G, or Chinese Nationalists or the Chinese Nationalist Party. Those all mean the same thing. Okay, Kuomintang is the Chinese nationalist power. And under Sun Yat-sen and as the ruling government of China, it's a republican form of government that has some of those things that we just talked about Sun Yat-sen wanting. People were able to vote in the government. They elected people. Technically, the Kuomintang is in power under Sun Yat-sen, and they're in charge of China, but the Kuomintang struggles to create a centralized government that everyone in China recognizes, right? China is a really big place, and so the Kuomintang successfully have this government in Nanjing, but not everyone all throughout China recognizes the Kuomintang as the rightful government of China. There's a few things there. One, China's huge, right? It takes a long time for everyone throughout China to recognize that that's the right government and to accept it, especially because the Kuomintang is a republican form of government. It's not a dynasty. It's different from what people are used to. So people far away in the west of China might say, I don't know if I'm going to recognize a government that doesn't have an emperor. That's kind of weird. Especially places where Confucianism is really strong, aka the majority of China. And Confucianism really leans on doing things the traditional way and maintaining traditions. And now the Kuomintang government is not following the Chinese tradition of the mandate of heaven and a dynasty. It's a new and a different type of things. So throughout China, even though the Kuomintang is technically the government, a lot of people and communities and villages don't necessarily recognize the Kuomintang as having control. And in many places, regional governors or regional warlords have the political power, and they don't recognize allegiance to any central government, and they're kind of doing their own regional thing while they're trying to figure out how the country is going to move forward in the future. In the 1920s, Sun Yat-sen passes away, and he is succeeded by this guy, Chiang Kai-shek. Again, Chinese language is not traditionally written with English letters, so our translations are a little bit iffy. Sometimes you'll see Chiang Kai-shek's name spelled with a J, Chiang Kai-shek. That's the same guy, Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek. It's the guy, he takes over the Kuomintang party in 1925 after the death of Sun Yat-sen. Chiang Kai-shek continues in Sun Yat-sen's vision of the party. He continues to grow and strengthen the government and the party, trying to convince more people throughout China to recognize them as the rightful ruler of China. And this is where some things get interesting. So while the Kuomintang is technically ruling China and growing in influence and power, at that same time, the Chinese Communist Party is formed, the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party does not recognize the Kuomintang as the rightful government. They disagree with some of the policies and the outlook that the Kuomintang has. And the Chinese Communist Party claims that it should be the rightful government of China. They argue that China should become a communist state with the CCP in charge of China. The Kuomintang rightfully acknowledge the Chinese Communist Party as a threat to their autonomy, right? The Kuomintang says, if the CCP is in charge, then we won't be in charge. So we have to get rid of the CCP so that we can be in charge of China. In order to get rid of the CCP, the Kuomintang makes an effort to drive out the communists. This becomes known as the 1935 Long March. So, and it's illustrated on this map right here. You see this pink section on this map right here is where most of the communist base was early in 1934. The Kuomintang knows that there's a lot of communists there, so they send in their armed forces and they say, we're going to drive you guys out. We're going to force you to leave. And basically, the Kuomintang is hunting down communists across China for the better part of a year. And on this map, you can see this arrow that shows where the communists go. And they're running and seeking refuge and going to different places to try and escape the Kuomintang. Kuomintang are not successful. They do not stamp out the CCP. The communists continue fleeing. Some of them drop out. They're like, man, no way am I going to run away from the Kuomintang for the rest of my life. That sounds terrible. But many of them who are convinced that communism is the right direction for China are willing to leave their homes, to become refugees, and to march across China for more than a year and to make these sacrifices. For those communist leaders who make this long march, who spend the better part of a year fleeing across China and living in unstable conditions, they come out as dedicated advocates of communism. They say, I've sacrificed so much to keep this Communist Party alive. I am going to stick with this for the rest of my life. Many of those people become dedicated and important leaders in the Chinese Communist Party. One of those who becomes an important leader and who participated in this long march is Mao Zedong, Here's his picture right here. We're going to hear a lot about Mao Zedong in the rest of the lecture, but this is where he first shows up as an early member of the Chinese Communist Party and someone who participates in this long march, who's driven out of different places and has to seek refuge because of his vision of communism. So we've got this conflict between the Kuomintang and the CCP where they're fighting against each other. They both want to be in charge of China. Neither one respects what the other party is doing in their vision. This continues until 1939 when World War II hits, right? Japan is on the Axis side, China is on the Allied side, and the very first fighting of World War II is the Japanese invasion and brutal massacre in Nanjing that takes place in 1939. At this point, both the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang realize that Japan invading and taking over China is a very real threat. And even though the communists and the nationalists have big differences, they have a similarity. Neither one of them want to be taken over by Japan. So they decide that during World War II, they're going to call a truce. They work together to make sure that China does not get taken over by Japan and make sure that Japan does not win in World War II. So from 1939 to 1945, some of those tensions between the communists and the nationalists die down, and instead they work together to make sure Japan doesn't take over. Immediately following World War II, after Japan has been neutralized and surrenders in August of 1945, the Civil War recommences, and the CCP and the Kuomintang resume fighting against each other. They fight from roughly 1945 to 1949, so for 4 years. At the end of that 4-year struggle, it becomes clear that the Chinese Communist Party, who are now led by Mao Zedong, will become the winners. They have mass support across China. They have more resources. They are doing better. So the CCP realizes they're going to win, and the Kuomintang realize they're going to win. So Chiang Kai-shek and the majority of the Kuomintang leaders flee China. They run out of China, and they sail across this little section of the South China Sea to Taiwan. And they set up the Kuomintang government in Taiwan. So the communist government takes over mainland China. The Kuomintang government takes over Taiwan. And that's how it still exists today. The Chinese Communist Party is in charge of the People's Republic of China. They have mainland China. And today, like 2021, our time, unless things change between the time I record this lecture in class, the Kuomintang government or the Republic of China is in charge of Taiwan. And it's still there to this day. If you go to Taiwan, the people of Taiwan will tell you that they're an independent country. They're a republican form of government. They're in charge of Taiwan. If you go to China, the official line from the Chinese government is that Taiwan actually belongs to them. And at some point, they're going to take over and make them fully communist, like mainland China. We'll see how it goes. It's exciting. I think, yep, that's great. Excellent. We're going to go to the next slide. If you need to pause, this is a great place to pause for a minute. But I'm not going to pause because I'm just going to keep going. Excellent. So the communists take over China under Mao Zedong. Now what? We're going to spend this slide looking at how China works and is managed under Mao Zedong. And the Chinese Communist Party. So Mao Zedong recognizes that China has a position of power in terms of they've got a lot of land, they've got a lot of natural resources, they've got a huge population, and he recognizes those strengths. However, Mao Zedong also knows that China is globally behind and industrially behind, and that they do not have all of the benefits and all of the technology that the West has. And so his goal is to take those strengths, Chinese land, Chinese population, Chinese natural resources, and get rid of those weaknesses. Bring China to the forefront of national power or international power and industrialization. Mao Zedong framed his own vision of Chinese communism in a way to lead that. So originally, communism or Marxism, as dictated by Karl Marx, discusses a proletariat and a bourgeoisie, right? The proletariat is the working class. They're oppressed by the bourgeoisie, and then the proletariat has a revolution. They take over, they kick out the bourgeoisie or the middle class and the upper class, and the proletariat take over, and they're in charge. Mao Zedong formulates this so that it's not so much proletariat versus bourgeoisie, but it's China versus the world. So instead of an oppressed proletariat, it's an oppressed Chinese people, and they're being oppressed by the rest of the world, especially by those Western powers. So instead of the bourgeoisie, it's the Western powers. And some of what we've seen makes sense, right? Those spheres of influence where Britain and France say, oh, you've got to follow our rules and we're going to be in charge of this area of China. Mao Zedong interprets those as Western oppression of Chinese people. And so he discusses this vision of communism where it's the people of China. They don't have to fight against each other. All of the people of China should work together and fight against and eventually economically dominate those Western powers that oppressed them. Mao Zedong, in creating this vision of Chinese communism, was not only inspired by Marx, but also got input and help from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is the biggest communist power during this time period. So China gets help from and inspiration from the Soviet Union for these programs. So some of the ways that Mao Zedong applies this Chinese communist vision to try and lead China forward are known as the Great Leap Forward. Everything on this slide falls under the category of Great Leap Forward. So you see all these other bullet points: agricultural collectives, people's communes, backyard furnaces. These are all a subset of the Great Leap Forward. And Great Leap Forward is Mao's plan for China in that 4-year period, 1954 to 1962. He wants to increase China's GDP, or their gross domestic product, how much China is producing. He wants to make China bigger and more economically powerful. He sees, like I said, he sees the means to this as by creating this Chinese communist narrative to increase production in China. And for Mao, the most important thing is to be ideologically correct. He wants everything they do in China to have a basis in Chinese communism. Everything should be able to tie back to communist ideology, should be able to show that China is fully integrated into communism. And sometimes Mao does things that make a lot of sense from a communist point of view, but that lack logic and common sense. And for Mao, being communist is more important than being logical. And so as long as something sounds communist and looks communist, even if it's not practical, he will pursue that activity, sometimes to great detriment, which we'll see at the end of this slide. So let's look at a few aspects of this Great Leap Forward. The first step for the Great Leap Forward is to create agricultural collectives. This sounds familiar to what we talked about with the Soviet Union. It's inspired by the Soviet Union's collectivization of agriculture. So instead of having different peasants working on land, maybe owning land, maybe working on land that other people own, the idea of a collective is that everyone collectively owns the land. They all work together to grow food on that land. No one owns one thing, but they all work together and they're a commune. Mao recognized that people had to choose to join communes. He didn't want to force them, but actually he just forced them. So on paper, it says that peasants chose to join collectives. And according to official Chinese policy, people chose to become members of collectives because they wanted to be communist. How that looked on the ground is the government would call in all peasants to mass meetings. They would teach them about collectives, and then they would not allow them to go back home until they joined the collective. So technically, everyone who was in a collective chose to join the collective, but they chose to do so because if they didn't, they would just be held by the government in a prison type of situation. So they chose, but it's a little bit of a coerced choice. The government then controlled the programs of the collectives with the goal of increasing the gross domestic product. So they set quotas for how many crops the people should grow. They set quotas for how the people should use their time. They set quotas for how much they had to sell the food for, how much money needed to be paid for it. And in this way, China, under Mao Zedong, made sure that more food was produced because they ordered it and there would be punishments if people didn't grow enough food. And they raised money for the government. They raised the price on food and they said people have to buy food or else they're going to starve to death. So if we make them pay more for food, we can take some of that extra money for the government and use it to increase government finances. So there's agricultural collectives. Technically people chose, but in realistic fashion, they didn't have very much choice. The government set all of the rules for it. And then anyone who didn't agree to participate, anyone who wanted to retain their private property was punished accordingly, much like they were in the Soviet Union, and especially in Ukraine, as we saw. So this agricultural collectivization, the elimination of private property, and making farmers work together towards government set goals is the first step of the Great Leap Forward. And that Mao takes a second and thinks about maybe he should get advice from other people. And this is where the 100 Flowers campaign comes in. Mao realized that he might not know the best ideas for everything, and he should work with experts. And so after instituting the collectivization of agriculture, he asks for suggestions from experts, and he calls it the 100 Flowers campaign. He says, if you're an expert in any field and you have ideas about how China can increase their gross domestic product, or how we can make more goods and achieve more on the world scale, please write into the government, tell us what we can do better, tell us what good ideas are, tell us if anything we're doing is not working well. And so hundreds of people wrote in and offered criticism or suggestions or alternate ideas. And they said, hey, instead of forcing peasants to join, maybe you should really actually let them choose and not just pretend to let them choose. And so all sorts of ideas about what the Chinese government could do better. And then Mao takes all those ideas, those suggestions, those criticisms, and he turns around and he says, if you criticize what the government is doing, or you said we weren't doing perfectly, you're going to get arrested and sent to work camps. So these people who thought they were offering suggestions to help the government ended up getting punished for them. He said, how dare you say that I'm not doing it the right way? Now you're in trouble. Now you're in trouble. What the heck? Why would he do that? So there's two different theories. Mao himself says it was a plan all along. It was a trap. I wanted to find out who wasn't really communist. So I said, what can we do better? And then I trapped everyone who wasn't 100% committed to communism, and I got rid of them. So one idea is that it was premeditated, that Mao was setting this trap where anyone who disagreed with him was going to reveal themselves, and then he would get rid of them. Some historians believe that Mao actually did want help to do things better, wanted to know how to do things better, but then when people criticized him, he was too weak to take it. He felt so offended by the fact that not everyone loved his ideas that he couldn't handle it, and he reacted in anger and had to get rid of them. No one's for sure which one it is. Different people have different perspectives. You can have your own perspective. But what are the facts? The facts are in the 100 Flowers campaign, Mao invited people to criticize the government, and then when they did so, he turned around and punished them severely. It's a lot like Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union, right? And they have the same effect of Stalin's purges. It sets the precedence that no one can criticize the government. That if you speak out against the government, you're putting yourself in danger and at risk. And it creates an environment of no criticism. So in the future, when Mao's programs under the Great Leap Forward are bad ideas and everyone knows they're bad ideas, no one will say anything against them because the punishment for speaking out against them is to get arrested and sent to a forced work facility. So people don't complain. Excellent. So after Mao gets rid of all of his critics and teaches everyone not to criticize him, he moves forward with more elements of the Great Leap Forward. And Great Leap Forward, again, is designed at increasing Chinese GDP, or gross domestic product, or the total amount of goods that China is producing. And Mao wants to increase the amount of agricultural goods produced and the amount of industrial goods produced. Okay. So he continues to increase agricultural production with the collectivization of agriculture. On those agricultural collectives, people live in what are known as people's communes. People's communes are, according to Mao, the basic organization of rural China. It's a bunch of people who all live in the same village, who have all participated in collectivized agriculture. They all have joint ownership over the land they're working, and they all work together to make sure that land is as productive as possible. People living in communes don't make money. They don't earn a wage. They don't have their own houses. There's a shared area for everybody to live. There's like a shared bunk room where everybody sleeps. There's a shared kitchen where everybody cooks food and eats together. So it's like a village type of thing. It's not individual families. It's the whole village is working together to grow food and to meet the government quotas. This idea of a people's commune, where it's the village that's the basic organization, this is a big break from Confucianism. Remember, under Confucianism, the family was the basic unit of society. In Confucianism, the family was the basic units of society. Under Chinese communism, the family is irrelevant. It is the commune that is the basic unit of society. The people that live and work in the same area of you, regardless of whether or not you're related to them, are your basic unit of society, and you work with them. Okay. So through collectivization of agriculture in people's communes, China sought to increase their agricultural production. To increase industrial production, Mao capitalized on some of the same ideology. Mao set the goal of doubling steel production in his first year, or in the first year of the Great Leap Forward. So by 1959, he wanted China to double its steel production. The method he used was backyard furnaces. Remember, we said earlier, one of the greatest strengths of China was its population. There are tons and tons of people in China. So Mao had the idea that if he could involve the masses, if every person in China would make a little steel, then the end result would be a lot of steel because there's so many people in China. So he went to the basic unit of society, the commune, and he said, hello, people's communes. Every people's commune needs to make a backyard furnace and make steel. So instead of having a big steel factory, we're just going to have every people's commune have their own little steel production furnace, and they will make steel. And Mao thought that if every people's commune made steel and made a certain quota of steel, they would have a huge amount of steel in China. So the ideology is that every people's commune is basically a mini steel factory as well as a farm. And the reality of this, it doesn't work out too well. Turns out that peasants who have not been trained in making steel are not good steel workers. I don't know if you guys saw that coming, but Mao didn't see it coming. Steel is a type of metal, right? And to have a steel furnace, you heat up an oven really hot, you put the iron in, you melt it down, you put it under immense pressure and heat, and it turns into steel. It becomes tempered through a thermochemical process. And usually you need a really big factory and like accurate instruments to gauge how hot it is and to see if you're putting the metal under enough pressure to test it, and other different specific things and scientific things to make sure that you're making high quality steel. Peasants didn't have access to that knowledge or to those resources, and so basically they built really big fires under their ovens, and they did their best to make steel. Often to fuel those fires, they burned up their own furniture, they burned up tools that they would have used, like wagons, and then to make the steel, they didn't have enough iron ore to make the steel that Mao wanted them to make, so they would burn down their pots and pans or their plows or their other farm tools. So these tools that they should have been using for agriculture, they melted them down so that they would have enough metal to make into steel so that it could meet government quotas. Ultimately, it's not successful. It's not successful. It's a dangerous process, right? Really big fires, uncontrolled amounts of heat, and low quality steel, right? People mixing together different types of metal to try and make this. And because they made fires out of their furniture and they burned up their tools, they lost productivity overall because they didn't keep their tools. So it's dangerous, it's unsuccessful, and it doesn't do what it wants, but no one speaks up against it because there's this culture of fear. They know that if they speak out against what the government is telling them to do, they could get in major trouble. So no one speaks up. There's an anti-criticism climate. It's not good. The Great Leap Forward is full of all sorts of things like this, and we see a pattern evolve. Low quality goods are produced at high human costs, right? So we just saw low quality steel being produced at a high human cost, a dangerous situation to be making steel in. And then because they burned up their tools, they had less tools to work with. But why did they do it? Because Mao said it's what they should do, because it was based in communist ideology. He said the best way to do steel is to have the people involved. Communism is about having people work together. So the people work together and make steel, and it will work out because it's communist ideology. It wasn't practical, though. It wasn't logical, and it didn't work out. A couple other examples of Mao coming up with ideas and policies that are based in communist ideology, but that logically don't work out and that were terrible. So one of them is called dense sowing. Sowing is in planting seeds for your crops. Dense is in deep. Mao's ideology, he said, if we plant seeds twice as deep as usual, the plants that grow from those seeds will have to be extra strong. right? If we plant the seeds twice as deep, the plants will have to be twice as strong to get to the top of the soil, and therefore we'll have really strong plants. And communism is about having really strong countries. So our strong communist country needs strong communist plants, so we're going to plant the seeds twice as deep. And so farmers plant the seeds twice as deep, and the seeds just don't grow because you can't plant seeds too deep. It just doesn't work. Like physically, biologically, it doesn't work. But people don't speak up against it because they don't want to get in trouble. Result, seeds didn't grow at all. People didn't speak up against it. There's less food. I lied. That was called deep sowing. Dense sowing, I'm so sorry, kids, students, young people. Deep sowing is when you plant them twice as deep. Dense sowing is where you plant twice as many seeds in the same field as you usually do. So if usually you plant 100 grain seeds in a field, Mao said, let's plant 200 grain seeds and we'll grow twice as much food. And just like communism, when we have more people working in communism, it's stronger. If we have more seeds in our communist fields, we'll have more food. So the ideology is communist. The result is terrible. They plant twice as much seeds, and then there's not enough nutrients in the soil for all those seeds. The result is crowded fields that don't yield as much food, and there's actually less food than there would have been if you only planted the right amount of seeds. But again, people don't speak up because they don't want to get in trouble. So we looked at 3 examples, these backyard furnaces, dense sowing, deep sowing, all based in communist ideology, but not logical and things that don't work out well. And they lead to these results of high human costs, especially from burning up farm equipment to make steel, and then dense sowing and deep sowing and bad ideas about how to make stronger crops led to a food shortage in the 1960s in China because they weren't growing enough crops. There wasn't enough food for people to eat. And that led to widespread starvation. And people get sick and die. Somewhere between 30 and 55 million people died in China in the early 1960s as a result of the Great Leap Forward. It is the worst famine in human history. And it's caused by these bad ideas about how to grow communist crops that people didn't speak up against because they were so afraid of getting punished by the government for speaking up. In fact, people were so afraid to speak up that they lied about these things and they said they were working. The official communist Chinese paperwork from this time period shows that these programs were a great success, that they did increase productivity and that people did do better. But people lied on that paperwork because they didn't want to get in trouble for not being productive. So they lied about it. They said it was working when in reality 30 to 55 million people died. Yikers. It's a huge, huge thing. Why didn't it have a huge negative effect on China? 30 to 55 million people, that's 3 times as many people as died in the Holodomor, that famine in the Ukraine. But it didn't have too much of an effect on China because remember, China's great strength is its people. There are so many people in China that this huge number of starvation deaths only accounted for about 5% of the Chinese population. So even though there's a huge amount of death, percentage-wise, it did not have a detrimental effect on the Chinese population. At the end of this 4-year period, Mao looks back at the Great Leap Forward, and he says that it was a great success, that backyard furnaces were wonderful, that the collectivization of agriculture was excellent, that he's led China into a bright new future. And then he discontinues all of the programs. So he says they were great, but he discontinues them because they truly were an abject failure. So we see this continuity emerging about Mao, that he will say that he's doing great, that he will expect people to lie to him, that he can't take criticism even when blatantly his policies were not good and led to immense suffering. And that's how China works out. So what did we look at with China? We looked at they went from being a dynasty to being a communist country. They fought a revolution over it and then a civil war over it. Eventually, the communists took over. Mao led the Chinese communist government in ideologically pure things, but in illogical policies that led to great human suffering. We're going to leave China off here at the end of the Great Leap Forward, which paradoxically was a terrible stumble backwards. And we're going to look at communist movements in 3 other countries, and then we'll skedaddle out of here, okay? I'm going to look at three, maybe more, a couple communist movements. So the big appeal of communism on paper is that communism leads to an equal distribution of wealth and resources, right? Any country with an unequal distribution might be tempted, especially those lower classes. If you are living in abject poverty, if you don't have enough money to feed your kids, and then you hear someone saying, well, if we were communist, everyone would have enough food. No one would be starving. No one would live in poverty. That sounds really good for you. So people in lower classes, people in countries where there's abject poverty, want communism. They tend to move towards communism because the promise is no one is going to starve to death. No one is going to be so poor they can't afford to live. As we know from the Holodomor and from the Great Leap Forward, that's not necessarily true. Plenty of people starve to death in Chinese countries. But supposedly and ideally, and if everything went according as it was supposed to go on paper, in a communist country, no one would starve to death, and there wouldn't be that type of deprivation. So we're going to look at a few other examples where there's a lower class that's suffering, and then as a result, they turn to communism because they want that benefit. They want those good things. So Vietnam is one of them, and we already looked at Vietnam, so we'll be real short with it. The 1940s. And in communism, remember, so we're looking for a lower class that's suffering and an upper class that's doing fine. The upper class is the French colonial powers, right? Vietnam as French Indochina, a French colony. The French were doing great. They were making tons of money from selling rubber from Vietnam. They were in charge. But the Vietnamese people themselves, most of the people working on those rubber plantations or doing other jobs in Vietnam, were not making money. And they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of resources, and they weren't doing well. The Viet Minh, we've already talked about that communist group in Vietnam. Their goal was to seize all land, to kick the French out, to take over French land, and to redistribute that land equally among all Vietnamese people. We've already looked at this, the same situation. So we've got a rich group, the French, the poor group, the Vietnamese, and then communism. The appeal is we'll kick the French out, we'll take over their land, and it will be equally distributed. Another example is the White Revolution in Iran, and we're moving all the way to the 1970s. So Vietnam, that was the 1940s. China is in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. Iran, all the way into the 1970s, was having these communist ideations. Excellent, excellent. Most people in Iran were landless peasants, so people that were growing food but who didn't own their own land, who were living probably in a state of poverty. Then the middle and upper class are the group of people that own most of the land that the peasants are working on. We've got most people, peasants, a few people in the middle and upper class, and then on the top of that structure we have the Shah. He's here in the middle of the page and also down here with a fancy military hat on. The Shah is the leader of Iran, and he wanted to modernize Iran. He wanted to industrialize Iran and make them more modern. He wanted them to be less third world. But he faced resistance from the upper and middle class. So those upper and middle class people who owned land and who were prosperous, they said, we don't want to modernize because we might end up losing power. We don't want to lose our elite status. We don't want to shake things up because we think it's working the way it is. Okay? So the Shah can't get things done because the upper and middle class aren't supporting him. But the Shah recognizes that there are way more people in the lower classes, and that if he can get their support, he won't need the upper and middle class. So the Shah turns to communism, and he says, I want the peasants to be on my side. I don't care so much about the upper and middle class because I'm working on increasing our international reputation. So he passes laws, and he creates laws that redistribute land equally. He takes the land away from the upper and middle class. He gives it to the peasants. The peasants love that, right? They're like, yes, we got free land. This is a very communist thing. Anytime we see people redistributing land, taking land away from people who own it and giving it equally to everyone who doesn't own it, this is a hallmark of communism in the 20th century. So he starts doing this. The peasants love it. He gets it on their side. And then the Soviet Union recognizes what's going on. Remember, the Soviet Union is our biggest communist power at this time period. They say, whoa there, Iran. I see that you're redistributing land. That's pretty communistic. And Iran says, sure is, we should be friends. And so the Soviet Union agrees to ally with Iran and gives them international help, gives them a leg up in modernizing and industrializing. And so the Shah is able to move forward with modernization because he has the peasant base supporting him. He's undermined the upper and middle class, and he's gotten international assistance from the Soviet Union. So the White Revolution, that's all known as the White Revolution, this movement where the Shah redistributes land and then allies with the Soviet Union in order to transform Iran. And then throughout Latin America, we see socialist and communist parties develop with the have the same goal of redistribution. Remember, most of our Latin American countries are republics, right? They revolted from Spain or Portugal, and they set up Republican forms of government with constitutions where they vote for their leaders and they get to vote on their laws. So just like Bernie Sanders today is running in races in America and is a democratic socialist, and he says, I'm a socialist, vote for me if you want me to redistribute wealth. We have a lot of socialists in politics in Latin America in the 20th century, and they say, vote for me and I'll redistribute wealth. Our guy up here who we have an example is Salvador Allende. He's got these fancy glasses on. He is a Chilean socialist / Marxist. And like Bernie Sanders, he runs for president, but unlike Bernie Sanders, he wins. And in 1970, he won the Chilean presidential election. And then as president, he began redistributing land and other resources, taking it away from the people who had it and giving it equally to everyone else. Okay, so this is communism. So in each of these three examples, we see a situation where the communist goal is they take the resources and redistribute it equally. And so there are three little examples here. Fun Cold War fact. In 1973, the U.S. decided that Salvador Allende in Chile was making a little too many waves, and so the CIA, the U.S. CIA, backed a coup. They assassinated Allende, and put in a non-communist government instead. Fun Cold War fact. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So in lecture today, we looked at a few things. We looked at the emergence of... Ooh, we're frozen. We looked at the emergence of communism in China, the struggle between the communists and the Kuomintang that the communists took over. They instituted these programs that ended up being pretty terrible. And then we looked at a few smaller examples of communism. Remember, anytime we see the redistribution of wealth, we're talking about a socialistic or a communistic government structure. Okay? Excellent. I hope you are having a great day. Either I saw you yesterday or I'm going to see you tomorrow. Even if I saw you yesterday, I'm going to see you tomorrow too because it's Wednesday. That'll be great. Excellent. If you have any questions or things that you don't understand from lecture, write them down. Bring them to class or to conference period. Deal? Let's see. Here we go. We're going to press pause. Where is the button? Here we go. Okay, you guys are terrific. You guys are wonderful. Good job, guys.